Trump just said something he hasn't said publicly before, that Netanyahu wants him to keep fighting Iran, and that he doesn't need Israel telling him what to do. In the same breath, he threatened to level Iran's bridges within an hour if talks fail. This lands in a war that's now run for close to 5 months, one where the American and Israeli positions have generally been described publicly as closely aligned. Here's exactly what Trump said, speaking to reporters ahead of a meeting. He said Netanyahu wants him to strike a location he named as Mount Kazma, adding that Netanyahu wants that specifically because he wants the US to stay in the war. Trump's own words were direct. "I don't have to. I don't need Bibi to tell me what to do. Bibi says this only because he wants me to stay involved." That's Trump publicly describing daylight between his own military judgment and what he's characterizing as pressure from Israel's prime minister. It's a rare instance of a sitting US president attributing a specific ulterior motive to an allied leader's military request, rather than simply disagreeing with the request itself on strategic grounds. In the same set of comments, Trump turned to Iran directly. He said that if Iran doesn't reach an agreement, he'll hit all of Iran's bridges within an hour, then hit all of its power plants within a day. He added a specific line about restraint alongside that threat, saying he's thinking about the 91 million people living in Iran. That combination, a rapid infrastructure ultimatum paired with an explicit reference to the country's civilian population, is a notable pairing on its own, since it places a stated humanitarian concern directly alongside one of the most sweeping infrastructure threats he's made in this war. He also said Iran has essentially agreed not to develop nuclear weapons, though he noted that commitment still needs to be made official. This isn't the first time this specific threat has come up. Back in March, Trump gave Iran a 48-hour deadline to fully reopen the Strait of Hormuz, warning on social media that the US would obliterate Iran's power plants, starting with the largest one, if that deadline passed. That ultimatum came shortly after Iran launched missiles at 2 communities in southern Israel, wounding roughly 180 people, some severely, in strikes that landed close to the country's main nuclear research center. Those Iranian strikes followed an earlier Israeli attack on Iran's Natanz nuclear site, part of a rapid exchange that both sides described as retaliation for the other's prior action. That earlier ultimatum came during a different, earlier phase of this war, and it followed a similar pattern to what we just heard, a specific infrastructure threat paired with a public deadline. Iran's response at the time came from multiple directions. The Speaker of Iran's parliament said that if the US and Israel targeted the country's power plants, Iran would treat infrastructure sites across the wider Gulf region as legitimate targets in return. Iran's Revolutionary Guard separately said it would fully close the Strait of Hormuz if that specific threat were carried out, while the head of the International Atomic Energy Agency urged maximum military restraint, specifically near nuclear facilities. By that point in March, the war's death toll had already climbed past 1,500 people in Iran, more than 1,000 in Lebanon, 15 in Israel, and 13 American service members, according to reporting from that period. The relationship between Trump and Netanyahu hasn't always sounded like this. Back in June, after US strikes hit 3 Iranian nuclear sites, Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan, Netanyahu publicly thanked Trump, calling the decision bold, righteous, and historic, and describing the American military as truly unsurpassed. He later nominated Trump for the Nobel Peace Prize during a dinner at the White House, presenting a formal nomination letter in front of both delegations. At that same dinner, Netanyahu told Trump, "He's forging peace as we speak, one country and one region after the other." And Trump responded that the gesture meant a great deal coming from him specifically. Netanyahu also credited a shared philosophy between the two leaders that night, describing their approach as peace through strength, saying strength comes first and peace follows. That was a moment of public alignment between the two leaders, presented at the time as a shared victory, with both governments emphasizing coordination rather than any daylight between them. What Trump said this week reads differently, a president publicly distancing himself from a specific military request attributed to Netanyahu, while framing his own position as independent of Israeli input. So what should we actually take from this shift in tone? Start with what's confirmed and what isn't. Trump's quotes about Netanyahu and Mount Kazma come from his own on-the-record comments to reporters, so the words themselves aren't in dispute. It's worth noting that Trump has a documented pattern of speaking about allied leaders in blunt, sometimes unfiltered terms during unscripted press interactions, which means comments like this one don't always signal a formal policy shift, even when the language itself sounds pointed in the moment. That history doesn't tell us whether this specific comment reflects a real strategic disagreement or simply Trump's characteristic speaking style. But it's relevant context for how much weight to place on any single unscripted remark. What's less clear is the underlying claim itself, that Netanyahu specifically wants the U.S. to strike this location in order to keep America involved in the war. Trump did not offer additional detail about what Mount Kazma is, why it holds strategic value, or when this alleged request from Netanyahu was made, based on the reporting available on these comments. That's Trump's characterization of Netanyahu's motives, not a statement or confirmation from Netanyahu or the Israeli government about what Israel is actually asking for or why. We don't have an on-the-record Israeli response to this specific claim as of this recording, which means we're currently hearing one side's account of a private conversation or request. There's a meaningful difference between a president disagreeing with an ally's strategic advice and a president suggesting that ally has a personal motive for wanting a war to continue. Trump's phrasing leans toward the second version, that Netanyahu's request is driven by a desire to keep the U.S. engaged rather than by a specific stated military objective. That's a notable accusation to make publicly about a close ally, even framed as an aside during a longer set of remarks about Iran, and it's worth tracking whether Netanyahu or Israeli officials respond to it directly in the coming days. Alliances between governments regularly involve disagreements over tactics and timing, without those disagreements becoming public, which is part of why Trump choosing to voice this particular tension openly, rather than keeping it behind closed doors, stands out on its own, regardless of whether the underlying claim about Netanyahu's motives turns out to be accurate. The nuclear claim in the same set of comments deserves its own caution. Trump said Iran has essentially agreed not to develop nuclear weapons, but immediately qualified that by saying the commitment isn't official yet. An unofficial, unconfirmed step toward an agreement isn't the same as a signed commitment, and previous points in this war have included similar verbal characterizations of progress that didn't always translate into finalized, binding agreements on the timeline initially suggested. We've seen this pattern before in this conflict, optimistic language about a nearing deal, followed by weeks or months where no formal agreement actually materializes, which is part of why a verbal claim of this kind deserves the same wait and verify approach we'd apply to any other unconfirmed diplomatic development. Treating this as a claim of progress rather than a confirmed diplomatic outcome is the same standard we've applied to every unverified statement throughout this conflict, regardless of which government or leader is making it. It's also worth sitting with the contrast inside Trump's own comments. In the span of a few sentences, he distanced himself from a request tied to Netanyahu, threatened to destroy Iranian infrastructure within a specific time frame, mentioned concern for Iran's civilian population, and claimed progress toward a nuclear agreement. Those four elements don't necessarily contradict each other. A leader can simultaneously threaten escalation, express concern for civilians, and claim diplomatic progress, but together they describe a message that's harder to categorize as purely aggressive or purely conciliatory. That mixed signal is consistent with a pattern we've tracked across multiple updates in this war, where Trump's public rhetoric doesn't always move in a single predictable direction, sometimes escalating and de-escalating within the same set of remarks rather than across separate, clearly divided statements. Audiences trying to gauge where this war is actually headed, based on public statements alone, are left weighing several simultaneous signals rather than following one consistent thread, which is part of why we've made a habit of separating out each individual claim rather than treating a single appearance or interview as a unified, coherent policy statement. Here's where this leaves things. Trump has publicly said Netanyahu wants the U.S. to strike a location he named as Mount Kazma, framing that request as an effort to keep America in the war and stating plainly that he doesn't need Netanyahu's direction. He's repeated a bridges and power plants ultimatum against Iran that closely echoes a similar threat from March, this time attaching a specific timeline and a stated concern for Iran's civilian population. He's also claimed Iran has essentially agreed to forego nuclear weapons, while acknowledging that commitment isn't formalized. None of Israel's government has responded on the record to the specific claim about Netanyahu's motives, as far as we've found in reporting available at this time. This comes only months after Netanyahu publicly thanked Trump for strikes on Iran's nuclear program and nominated him for the Nobel Peace Prize, a reminder of how quickly the public tone between allied leaders can shift, or at least how quickly one side's public description of that relationship can shift, even without a formal break in the underlying alliance. Whether that shift reflects a genuine change in the working relationship between the two leaders, or simply a single unscripted comment that doesn't represent a broader pattern, isn't something that can be settled from one set of remarks alone. We're not going to guess whether this signals a real rift between Trump and Netanyahu or a passing comment that fades by next week. But we do want to ask you, when a president publicly says an ally wants him to keep fighting a war for reasons beyond the stated military objective, how much weight do you personally give that kind of claim without the other side's response? And would your answer change if Netanyahu directly disputed it tomorrow?